Juliet Collins never imagined that being late on a Monday morning would mark a turning point in her life. Her heels clicked urgently against the New York City sidewalk as she rushed toward the subway station, clutching her laptop bag tightly. A crucial meeting, where she hoped to secure a promotion after 5 years as a junior analyst at Morton & Associates, was about to take place in 20 minutes. However, her focus was abruptly diverted by an unusual scene. In the middle of the hurried crowd, an older man in an expensive suit collapsed on the sidewalk, scattering his briefcase. Papers fluttered in the air as people rushed past, some even stepping on him without noticing. Juliet stopped abruptly, her heart racing. Without hesitation, she knelt beside the man, ignoring the dirt gathering on her black pencil skirt. "Sir, can you hear me?" Her voice trembled as she tried to find a pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. She immediately dialed 911, her other hand holding the man's sweaty wrist. "Please send an ambulance. I think he's having a heart attack." Her voice broke as she pleaded with the dispatcher. The minutes until the ambulance arrived felt like hours. Juliet kept talking to the unconscious man, trying to maintain a connection in the hope that her voice would anchor him to life. "Stay with me. You're going to be okay. Help is on the way." She noticed a gold wedding band on his finger and thought of his family, silently praying he wouldn't be lost to them. When the paramedics arrived, they confirmed her fears. "It's definitely a heart attack. You probably saved his life by acting so quickly," one of them said. Without a second thought, Juliet climbed into the ambulance with the man. Her conscience wouldn't let her leave him alone. During the ride, her phone rang repeatedly with notifications from her supervisor, but Juliet ignored them. The insistent sound only heightened the weight of her decision. At the hospital, Juliet provided the nurses with the little information she had. After 2 hours of waiting for updates, she realized how much time had passed. She had missed her promotion meeting entirely. With smudged makeup and wrinkled clothes, she arrived at the office too late. Mr. Peterson, her inflexible boss, was waiting at her desk. "Miss Collins, in my office. Now." His sharp voice pierced the tense silence of the floor. Juliet's colleagues avoided her gaze as she walked by, though she knew exactly what was coming. "You missed the most important meeting of the quarter," Mr. Peterson began, his tone frighteningly calm. "A meeting where our biggest client was present and where you were supposed to present the quarterly analysis you prepared. Sir, there was an emergency." I don't care if the sky was falling, Miss Collins. This company doesn't run on excuses." He slid a termination letter across the desk. "Pack your things. Security will escort you out." Juliet's throat tightened as she packed her belongings. Her phone buzzed again. It was the hospital. The man she had helped was still in critical condition. The nurses asked her to return to assist with some paperwork, as they hadn't been able to reach his family. Standing in the lobby with a box of her belongings, Juliet looked at her phone and then at the gleaming tower that had been her second home. She was devastated, but something pulled her back toward the hospital. "I made the right choice," she told herself, straightening her shoulders before hailing a cab. From that moment on, Juliet's days became a battle. Her savings dwindled while rejection emails piled up. The termination cast a shadow over her resume, and rumors about her unreliability spread quickly in the industry. Even so, she visited the man at the hospital every day. Room 412. That sterile space became her refuge. She brought fresh flowers and spoke to the unconscious man as if he could hear her. Juliet shared her frustrations, fears, and even dreams. Sometimes, she cried quietly as she spoke. One particularly hard day, after yet another job rejection, Juliet broke down. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, but you know what? I don't regret helping you. Not for a second." She stayed by the side of the man no one knew, even as her own life seemed to be falling apart. Each day in room 412 reinforced Juliet's belief that, even in the worst moments, kindness was still the best choice. The call came as Juliet was packing the last of her belongings into worn-out boxes. The voice on the other end was urgent. "Miss Collins, there's been a change in Mr. Richardson's condition. We recommend that you come to the hospital." Her heart pounded. She dropped the half-packed suitcase, grabbed her bag, and called a cab. The anxiety grew with each second lost in traffic. When she finally arrived, the hospital's fluorescent lights felt sharper than usual. The walk to room 412 felt endless and heavy with anticipation. She noticed nurses speaking in hushed but excited tones as she passed. Reaching the door, she hesitated. Her hand trembled as it touched the handle. Whatever awaited her inside would undoubtedly change everything again. Opening the door, she gasped. The man who had seemed a shadow of life for weeks was sitting upright in bed, his eyes open and alert. His expression was gentle, but his gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that made her freeze. "So, you're my guardian angel." His voice was deep, warm, and somehow familiar, despite Juliet never having heard it before. She stood there, stunned. Tears welled up but didn't fall. He was awake, and he knew. "You can hear me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I heard everything," Daniel Richardson replied, his tone steady. "Your stories, your fears, your struggles. Every word." Confusion flooded Juliet's mind. How could he possibly know so much? She slowly sank into the chair that had become her companion over the past weeks. How do you know about my termination, about Mr. Peterson?" "I never said his name," she stammered, the question spilling out. Daniel smiled faintly, though his gaze grew serious. "Because Morton and Associates is my company. I'm the CEO," he said, straightening slightly in the hospital bed. "Though I prefer to keep that quiet. I visit branches without notice to see how they truly operate." Peterson, as I suspected, proved to be exactly as the rumors described. The room seemed to tilt. The man for whom she had sacrificed her career was, in fact, the owner of the company that had cast her aside. "So you know I was fired for stopping to help you," she said, her voice breaking. Daniel nodded, his expression hardening. "I do. And it was the best decision you could have made because now I have the chance to fix two injustices. Your dismissal and the toxic culture Peterson has cultivated." He reached for a folder on the bedside table. When he handed it to Juliet, her hands trembled. Inside was a contract offering her the position of Chief Operating Officer, with a generous salary, full benefits, and, to her astonishment, an apartment in the same building where Daniel lived. "But I'm just a junior analyst." "I don't know how," she began, but he cut her off with a reassuring smile. "You've demonstrated more integrity and leadership over the past few weeks than Peterson has in his entire career. That's something you can't learn in an MBA program. It's in you." The tears finally spilled over. Juliet couldn't find the words, so she simply nodded, overwhelmed by the weight of the offer and the relief that her suffering might have led to something meaningful. The next morning, the hospital buzzed with subtle commotion as Daniel formally announced Peterson's dismissal. Juliet stood by his side, still trying to process how quickly her life had turned around. The man who had been a stranger not long ago had become the pivotal figure in her world. The new routine was a baptism by fire. Juliet dove headfirst into her role, helping to restructure Morton and Associates while implementing a more compassionate culture. True to his word, Daniel became her mentor, guiding her through the complexities of leading a corporation. But amidst the long strategy meetings and late-night calls, something deeper began to grow. One rainy night in New York, Juliet was poring over employee feedback surveys at the office when she felt Daniel's presence at the door. "You're here late again," he remarked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Don't regional directors usually read employee surveys at 11 p.m., she joked, trying to mask her exhaustion. "They don't. And most regional directors didn't earn their positions by talking to their bosses while they were in comas," he said with a soft laugh, though his tone grew serious. "Juliet, can I ask you something?" She glanced up, intrigued by the sudden shift in his demeanor. "What is it?" "Have dinner with me tomorrow. Not as your boss or mentor. Just dinner." Her heart raced. The carefully maintained professional boundary between them was beginning to fracture. "That sounds complicated," she replied, smiling hesitantly. "Life is complicated, Juliet. Sometimes you're late to work and end up saving someone's life. Sometimes you lose everything and gain something far better." He stepped closer, his gaze locking with hers. "And sometimes you fall in love with the sound of someone's voice before you've even opened your eyes." 2 days later, Juliet found herself back in room 412, but this time not to care for a patient. Daniel had arranged the space for an intimate dinner. Battery-operated candles replaced the cold hospital lighting, and the atmosphere was almost magical. "This place," Juliet said, looking around, "means so much to both of us." "More than I can put into words," Daniel replied. "During those weeks, your visits kept me connected. I needed them as much as you did. Their dinner was a mix of laughter and heartfelt memories. It was clear that what they shared was rare, built on a foundation of trust and empathy that couldn't be manufactured. As they left the room, Daniel held Juliet's hand. "This is just the beginning. I know it." Juliet felt the same way. For the first time in a long while, she believed that even the worst moments could open doors to something extraordinary. The following weeks were a delicate dance between work and a budding relationship. Juliet and Daniel focused on rebuilding Morton and Associates, but their professional collaboration was peppered with shared smiles, inside jokes, and unspoken moments of connection. It wasn't just about the company anymore. Something deeper was forming between them. One drizzly morning in New York, Juliet arrived early at the office, a habit she had developed since her promotion. She was finalizing an analysis report when Daniel appeared in the doorway. "How long have you been here?" he asked, arms crossed, studying her intently. "Not as long as it looks," she replied, smiling as she remained focused on the screen. Daniel stepped into the room, pulling a chair beside her. "I need you to join me for an important meeting this afternoon," he said casually, though his tone carried weight. "Something last minute?" Juliet asked, raising an eyebrow. "Not quite. I want you to meet some of the board members. They've been asking about you." Her stomach churned. Facing the company's board of directors was something she hadn't expected so soon. Before she could voice her hesitation, Daniel stood. "Don't worry. They're already impressed. They just need the chance to hear your vision." His confidence in her was reassuring, but Juliet knew how much was riding on this. She spent the rest of the morning rehearsing silently, reviewing data and scenarios in her head. The Morton and Associates boardroom was imposing, with floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing a panoramic view of the city and a long, polished table surrounded by influential figures. Daniel, as always, looked at ease, but Juliet felt the weight of every gaze as they entered. "Gentlemen, this is Juliet Collins, our new Chief Operating Officer," Daniel announced, his pride evident in his voice. Juliet took a deep breath and began her presentation. She spoke with clarity, outlining the cultural changes she had implemented since taking on her role. Flexible work policies, emergency leave benefits, and strategies to attract new talent were at the forefront. As she spoke, she noticed approving nods around the table, her initial nerves giving way to a steady confidence. When she finished, an older board member with a sharp gaze, Mr. Marston, leaned forward. "Impressive, Miss Collins. This company needed fresh perspective, and you've delivered. Well done." Then he turned to Daniel. "You were right. Promoting her was a bold decision, but it was clearly the right one." Juliet exhaled deeply, trying to suppress the wave of relief that washed over her. As they left the room, Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I told you they'd be impressed." She smiled, still catching her breath. His encouragement meant more than he realized. That evening, as Juliet strolled through the rain-slicked streets, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. The city, which had once seemed so overwhelming, now felt full of possibilities. Her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Dinner at the usual spot? I think we've earned it." She smiled. The usual spot was a cozy bistro near the hospital where they'd started going after long days at work. Daniel loved its unpretentious charm, and Juliet appreciated the simplicity of the menu. When she arrived, Daniel was already seated at a corner table, 2 glasses of wine waiting. "Well," he asked, raising his glass. "To your flawless presentation." Juliet raised hers, grinning. "To our team." They toasted, and for a moment, the world shrank to just the two of them. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, filled with laughter and candid moments. Yet, there was an undercurrent of something unspoken, a shift neither had fully addressed. When Daniel held her hand for a beat longer than usual, the air between them changed. "Juliet, there's something I need to say." She leaned in, sensing the seriousness in his voice. "What is it?" Daniel hesitated before speaking. "I think there's a bigger problem at Morton and Associates than I initially thought. Peterson left behind more than just toxic leadership." Juliet's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" He sighed, looking troubled. "There are signs of fraudulent practices in the contracts he signed. Payments to non-existent vendors, shady agreements with shell companies. It's a mess." Her heart sank. Fraud meant potential legal and financial disasters for the company. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease rising within her. "We investigate quietly for now. If we can uncover enough evidence, we'll turn it over to the authorities." His voice softened. "I trust you to help me figure this out." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. His faith in her was unwavering, and that gave her strength. In the following days, Juliet and Daniel delved into the suspicious contracts. What they found was alarming. Payments to a company called Owlstone Logistics, which appeared in nearly every questionable transaction. Despite its frequent mention, the company seemed to exist only on paper. "This is suspicious," Juliet remarked, showing the findings to Daniel. He studied the documents, his expression grim. "I've never heard of this company. We need the audit team to dig deeper." Hours later, the audit report confirmed their fears. Owlstone Logistics was a shell company, likely created to funnel money out of the business. Peterson's involvement was evident, but there were hints that someone more powerful was pulling the strings. Late one evening, while Juliet was reviewing more documents, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When she read the message, her blood ran cold. "Stop digging, or the consequences will be dire for both of you." She showed the message to Daniel, her hands trembling. "It looks like we're closer to the truth than we thought," he said, his jaw tightening. That night, as they drove home, Juliet noticed a black car following them. Her pulse quickened. "Daniel, I think we're being followed." He glanced at the rearview mirror, his expression hardening. "Let's see how far they're willing to go." He made a sudden turn, then another, but the car stayed behind them. Juliet gripped the edge of her seat, her adrenaline spiking. When Daniel finally managed to lose the car, the weight of the situation pressed down on both of them. "This isn't just about the company anymore," Juliet said, her voice barely a whisper. "We're in real danger." Finding Owlstone Logistics' connection to Morton and Associates was only the beginning. Juliet and Daniel now realized they were facing a far-reaching conspiracy that extended well beyond Peterson's fraudulent contracts. The cryptic threats and the black car that had tailed them were proof enough. Someone powerful wanted to keep their secrets buried. The next morning, Daniel called a meeting with his private investigator, Paul Reed, who had been quietly working behind the scenes to track down any leads. "We've confirmed Owlstone Logistics is a shell company," Daniel explained. "But we need to find out who's behind it." Paul nodded, his demeanor calm but focused. "I've been tracing transactions linked to Owlstone," he began. "And one name keeps coming up. Craig Landers." Juliet froze. The name was familiar. "Craig Landers used to work at Morton and Associates," she said, glancing at Daniel. "He left a few years ago under suspicious circumstances." Paul nodded. "Exactly. He's been acting as a middleman, handling the financial side of this operation. If we can find him, we might get closer to whoever's running the show." Juliet exchanged a look with Daniel. Craig might be their best chance at unraveling the scheme, but confronting him wouldn't be easy. "Where is he now?" Daniel asked. Paul slid a folder across the table. "Newark, New Jersey. I've got an address. He's been keeping a low profile, but I doubt it'll stay that way if he knows you're looking for him." Later that day, Juliet and Daniel drove to the address in Newark, a rundown apartment building with peeling paint and broken windows. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, save for the occasional distant sound of traffic. Daniel parked a block away, and they approached the building cautiously. "Are you sure about this?" Juliet whispered as they stood in front of the door. "We don't have a choice," Daniel replied, his tone firm. Daniel knocked on the door. At first, there was no response, but then heavy footsteps approached. The door creaked open to reveal a gaunt man with unkempt hair and a wary expression. "Who the hell are you?" Craig Landers demanded, his voice rough. Daniel stepped forward. "We know about Owlstone Logistics. We know you've been working with Peterson to funnel money. And we know this is bigger than just you." Craig's face paled, but he quickly masked his reaction. "I don't know what you're talking about. Get out before I call the cops." Juliet stepped in, her voice steady but urgent. "Listen, we've already received threats. We're being followed. If you're in this, you're just as much a target as we are. Help us, and maybe we can help you." Craig hesitated, glancing nervously down the hallway as if expecting someone to appear. Finally, he opened the door wider and gestured for them to come inside. The apartment was as disheveled as Craig himself, with papers, food wrappers, and empty beer cans strewn across every surface. Craig closed the door and leaned against it, crossing his arms. Peterson dragged me into this mess, he began, his voice bitter. He knew I needed the money, and he used that against me. Al Stone was his idea, but it's not just about him. There are bigger players in this game. Who? Daniel asked, his tone sharp. Craig hesitated, looking like he was weighing his options. There's a man named Malcolm Reeves. He's the one running the whole operation. Peterson was just a pawn. Reeves uses these fake companies to launder money and make deals with people you don't want to mess with. Juliet's heart sank. Malcolm Reeves was a name she had heard whispered in corporate circles. A ghost who left ruin in his wake but was never caught. Where can we find him? Daniel pressed. Craig laughed bitterly. Good luck. Reeves doesn't leave a trail. He operates through layers of intermediaries. I've never even met him. All I know is, if you're digging this deep, you're already on his radar. Juliet shivered. Craig's words confirmed her worst fears. They were in far more danger than they had imagined. Suddenly, Craig glanced out the window and froze. You need to leave. Now. What? Juliet asked, alarmed. They've found me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And now they know you're here. Juliet and Daniel didn't wait to argue. They rushed out of the apartment, their adrenaline spiking as they noticed a black car parked down the block. As they started to walk away, the car's engine roared to life, and it began to follow them. Get in the car, Daniel shouted, pulling Juliet toward their vehicle. As soon as they were inside, Daniel floored the accelerator. The black car followed close behind, weaving through traffic as if it had no intention of letting them escape. Daniel, what do we do? Juliet asked, her voice trembling. Hold on, Daniel replied, making a sharp turn into a narrow alley. The car behind them followed, its tires screeching on the pavement. Daniel made another sudden turn, exiting the alley onto a side street. For a moment, the black car was out of sight, but Juliet knew they weren't safe. Back at Juliet's apartment, they barely had time to catch their breath before Daniel's phone rang. It was Paul. Craig Landers is dead, Paul said grimly. They found him an hour after you left. Looks like they made it look like a break-in gone wrong. Juliet clutched Daniel's arm, her face pale. We were just with him, she whispered. They're covering their tracks. Daniel tightened his grip on the phone, his jaw clenched. This isn't over. We have to move faster. Paul sighed on the other end of the line. I'll dig deeper into Reeves, but you two need to be careful. They'll come after you next. That night, Juliet barely slept. Every creak of the apartment seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Daniel stayed up, pacing the living room, his mind racing with possibilities. We have to take this to the authorities, Juliet said the next morning. We can't do this alone. Daniel nodded, but his expression was grim. First, we need to gather enough evidence to make it stick. Reeves has survived investigations before. If we go to the authorities without everything, he'll slip away and come after us even harder. Juliet hated the thought of waiting, but she knew Daniel was right. Reeves wasn't just another fraudster. He was a predator, and they were now firmly in his sights. Uncovering the truth about Malcolm Reeves and his criminal empire was proving to be a dangerous task. Juliet and Daniel had learned that Craig Landers had been killed to silence him, and the looming threat against their own lives grew more tangible with each passing day. But the stakes were too high to turn back. The morning after Craig's death, Daniel gathered Juliet and their private investigator, Paul Reed, in a discreet meeting at a coffee shop far from their usual haunts. Paul arrived with an envelope of fresh findings. I traced several transactions linked to Al Stone Logistics, Paul began, sliding the papers toward Juliet and Daniel. They connect to offshore accounts under various shell companies. One common thread links them all. A man named Vincent Stokes. Stokes? Juliet asked, flipping through the documents. Who is he? Paul leaned back, his tone grim. He's a broker for people like Reeves. A fixer. He handles logistics and ensures that money flows through the system without raising suspicion. If we can get to him, he might lead us directly to Reeves. Daniel frowned, studying the file. And where can we find this Stokes? That's the tricky part, Paul admitted. Stokes is elusive. He moves constantly, operating out of private clubs and safe houses. But I found a pattern. He frequents a high-end poker game in Midtown every few weeks. It's happening tomorrow night, Juliet raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting we crash a poker game filled with people who probably have as much to hide as Reeves? Paul shrugged. It's risky, but if you want a shot at Stokes, that's your window. The following evening, Juliet and Daniel dressed to blend in with the elite crowd attending the poker game. Juliet wore a sleek black dress, and Daniel donned a tailored suit. As they approached the private club, the tension between them was palpable. This is insane, Juliet whispered as they walked toward the entrance. What if Reeves's people are here? Daniel placed a steady hand on her back. We'll be careful. If we sense anything's wrong, we leave immediately. The bouncer at the door scrutinized them briefly, but allowed them entry after Daniel handed him a membership fee in the form of a thick stack of cash. Inside, the room was buzzing with chatter, the air heavy with cigar smoke and the clinking of glasses. The poker table sat at the center, surrounded by a mix of sharp-dressed players and shadowy figures. Juliet spotted Vincent Stokes immediately, a wiry man with slicked back hair and a smirk that exuded confidence. That's him, she whispered to Daniel. Daniel nodded. I'll approach. You stay close, but don't draw attention. Juliet's heart pounded as she watched Daniel casually take a seat at the poker table. He played the part of an overconfident businessman seamlessly, engaging in light banter with the other players while keeping a close eye on Stokes. After a few hands, Daniel finally made his move. Mr. Stokes, he said, leaning slightly across the table, I've heard your name mentioned in some very exclusive circles. They say you're the man to talk to when it comes to complicated financial arrangements. Stokes' smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. I don't know what you're talking about, he replied coolly. I'm just here for the cards. Daniel leaned back, a faint smile on his lips. Fair enough, but if you ever feel like chatting outside this table, I'd love to discuss an opportunity. Stokes' eyes narrowed, studying Daniel as if trying to determine if he was a threat. Before he could respond, the room erupted with commotion. A group of men stormed in, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere. They're Reeves's men, Juliet whispered, recognizing one of the figures from the car that had followed them. Daniel stood quickly, his hand brushing Juliet's arm as a signal to leave. They began moving toward the exit, but one of the men spotted them. Stop them, he shouted. What followed was chaos. Daniel and Juliet weaved through the crowd, pushing past startled onlookers as the men gave chase. The club's bouncers intervened, trying to contain the disturbance, giving Juliet and Daniel just enough time to slip out the back door. Out on the street, they ran until they found a cab, sliding into the back seat. Both of them gasped for breath as the driver sped away. That was close, Juliet said, her voice shaky. Too close. Daniel checked his phone. In the rush, he hadn't had time to grab anything from Stokes, but he noticed a text from an unknown number. You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Richardson. Leave it alone or next time there won't be a warning. He showed it to Juliet, who clenched her fists. They know exactly who we are. This isn't going to stop, is it? Daniel shook his head. Not until we finish this. The encounter at the poker game wasn't entirely fruitless. Paul later confirmed that Stokes had left the club shortly after the commotion, and his phone records showed a series of calls made immediately after. One of those calls pinged near a warehouse in the Bronx, a location Paul suspected was connected to Reeves's operations. We need to get in there, Paul suggested. If we can find physical evidence, it could tie Reeves directly to the fraud. Juliet hesitated. This keeps getting more dangerous. If Reeves's men catch us there. Daniel interrupted, his tone firm. Then we'll make sure they don't. But this might be our only chance to bring him down. Late the next night, Juliet, Daniel, and Paul arrived at the warehouse, dressed in dark clothing and carrying flashlights. The area was desolate, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of distant traffic. Paul picked the lock on the side door, and they slipped inside. The interior was vast and cluttered with crates, filing cabinets, and shipping containers. Juliet's flashlight swept over rows of papers and ledgers stacked haphazardly on a desk. Start looking for anything connected to Al Stone or Reeves, Daniel whispered. As they searched, Juliet found a folder containing invoices and transaction records bearing Al Stone Logistics' name. Her heart raced as she flipped through the pages. This is it, she said, holding up the folder. It's all here. Before they could celebrate, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Paul's face hardened. We've got company. The heavy tension that surrounded Juliet and Daniel following Craig Lander's death was unrelenting. They knew Reeves was tightening his grip, eliminating anyone who posed a threat. Paul's discovery of a possible connection to Reeves through a Bronx warehouse had given them a sliver of hope, but it was fraught with danger. That night, they prepared themselves to infiltrate the warehouse. Paul had assured them the building was minimally guarded, but Juliet couldn't shake the fear that they were walking straight into a trap. The warehouse loomed in the shadows of a desolate industrial area, its weathered exterior blending into the night. Paul picked the lock on a side door and they slipped inside. The interior smelled of dust and oil, and rows of crates lined the dimly lit space. "We're looking for anything that ties Reeves directly to the shell companies or Alstone Logistics," Paul whispered. Juliet held a flashlight, her fingers trembling slightly. Daniel stayed close, his eyes scanning the rows of crates for anything unusual. They moved cautiously, the quiet only interrupted by the occasional creak of a floorboard or the distant hum of passing cars. After minutes of searching, Juliet spotted a metal filing cabinet tucked behind a stack of boxes. She opened the drawers and found ledgers, invoices, and shipping manifests. Her heart raced as she flipped through them. "These are linked to Alstone," she said, holding up the documents. "Payments, fake vendors, it's all here." Daniel looked over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. "This is enough to take to the authorities," he said. "Let's get out of here." Before they could move, a noise shattered the silence. The metallic clang of a door slamming echoed through the warehouse, followed by muffled voices. "We've got company," Paul muttered, pulling out his phone to send a quick message for backup. "The police are 15 minutes out." "We don't have 15 minutes, Juliet said, clutching the folder tightly. Daniel gestured toward the back of the warehouse. "There's a second exit. Let's move." They crept through the maze of crates and machinery, but the voices grew louder. Juliet glanced over her shoulder and saw flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. Her breathing quickened. As they approached the rear exit, the silhouette of a man stepped into their path. He raised a flashlight, illuminating their faces. "Freeze!" the man barked, reaching for a weapon. Daniel lunged forward, knocking the man off balance. Paul grabbed Juliet's arm and pulled her toward the door. "Go! I'll cover you!" Paul shouted. "No!" Juliet protested. But Paul was already moving, positioning himself between them and the approaching voices. Daniel grabbed her hand, urging her forward. "We have to keep moving." They burst through the back door into the cold night air. The alley behind the warehouse was narrow and empty, but the sound of boots on the pavement told them their pursuers weren't far behind. "This way," Daniel said, leading Juliet toward a chain-link fence. She climbed quickly, the folder still clutched in one hand. As she dropped to the other side, Daniel followed, landing beside her just as a shout rang out from behind them. "There they are!" A gunshot echoed, and Juliet ducked instinctively, her heart pounding. Daniel grabbed her hand, pulling her into the shadows of a nearby alley. They ran for what felt like an eternity, the sounds of their pursuers growing faint. Finally, they reached a main road, where a cab idled at a stoplight. Daniel waved it down, and they climbed inside, gasping for breath. "Drive. Anywhere," Daniel instructed the driver. Juliet slumped back in her seat, still clutching the folder. Her hands trembled, but her grip remained firm. "That was too close," she said, her voice shaky. Daniel placed a hand on her knee, his touch grounding her. "We've got what we came for. It's over." But Juliet wasn't so sure. The fear that Reeves's men would come after them again was gnawing at her. Back at a safe house Paul had arranged, they reviewed the documents more closely. The evidence was overwhelming. Detailed payments to Alstone Logistics, transactions routed through offshore accounts, and email correspondence implicating Reeves directly. "This is enough to bury him," Daniel said, his voice filled with resolve. Paul arrived a short while later, his face grim. "They're onto us. Reeves's men know you escaped with the evidence, and they won't stop until they get it back." "What do we do now?" Juliet asked, her exhaustion evident. "We go straight to the authorities," Paul replied. "First thing in the morning, we hand this over to a federal prosecutor. With this kind of evidence, they'll have no choice but to act." That night, Juliet couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind made her heart race. Daniel stayed awake with her, his presence a small comfort in the storm of her thoughts. "Do you think this will end tomorrow?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel sighed, wrapping an arm around her. "It has to. We can't keep living like this." She nodded, though the doubt lingered. The next morning, they met with Richard Harmon, a no-nonsense federal prosecutor who specialized in white-collar crime. Harmon examined the folder carefully, his expression growing more serious with each page. "This is excellent work," he said finally. "We'll initiate proceedings against Reeves immediately. But you need to be aware he won't go down without a fight. People like him don't let go of power easily." "We know," Daniel replied. "Just tell us what you need from us." Harmon stood, extending his hand. "Stay under protection until this is resolved. We'll take it from here." As they left Harmon's office, Juliet felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The evidence was out of their hands, but the danger wasn't over. That evening, they returned to the safe house, hoping for a moment of peace. But peace was fleeting. Around midnight, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You've made a mistake. This isn't over." Before he could respond, the sound of shattering glass erupted from the living room. Someone had thrown a rock through the window, and the sharp sound of tires screeching outside followed. Juliet's chest tightened as she realized Reeves's reach extended further than they had imagined. "We have to leave," Daniel said urgently, grabbing her hand. "They won't stop until they've silenced us." Juliet nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Despite everything, she refused to let fear consume her. "We'll finish this," she said firmly. "No matter what it takes." The heavy footsteps echoed closer, their pace deliberate and threatening. Juliet clutched the folder of incriminating documents to her chest, her heart pounding. Daniel and Paul exchanged tense glances, both understanding the severity of the moment. "We need to get out of here," Daniel whispered, his voice firm but low. "Now!" Paul gestured toward a back entrance, keeping his flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. Juliet followed, her grip on the folder tightening as the footsteps multiplied, indicating more men had entered the warehouse. As they moved through the darkened aisles of crates and machinery, a flashlight beam swept past them. One of Reeves's men called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "Spread out. They're here somewhere." Juliet felt a surge of panic as the beams of light moved closer. Paul motioned for them to stop, then gestured toward a ladder leading to a mezzanine. They climbed silently, their movements slow and deliberate to avoid making noise. From above, they had a clearer view of the warehouse floor and the men searching for them. "3 of them," Paul muttered, counting the figures below. Juliet's breathing was shallow, her focus entirely on keeping the folder secure. Daniel leaned close to her ear. "We can't let them find this evidence, no matter what happens." She nodded, her resolve hardening despite the fear coursing through her veins. One of the men kicked over a stack of crates, causing a loud crash that echoed through the warehouse. The noise startled Juliet, but she kept her composure. Paul reached for his phone and quickly typed a message. "Police. 911. Backup needed at Bronx warehouse now." He showed the screen to Daniel, who gave a curt nod, but they all knew help wouldn't arrive in time to prevent a confrontation. "Stay here," Paul whispered. "I'll distract them." Juliet grabbed his arm. "No! We stay together." But Paul was already moving, descending the ladder silently and slipping into the shadows below. Moments later, a metallic clang echoed through the warehouse as Paul knocked over a set of shelves. The men turned toward the sound, their flashlights converging. "There!" one of them shouted, running toward the noise. Paul led them in the opposite direction, giving Juliet and Daniel a precious window of time. Daniel motioned for her to follow him down the mezzanine stairs toward the back exit. They moved quickly, the folder still clutched tightly in Juliet's arms. As they neared the exit, another figure emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. It was Reeves. "I expected better from you, Richardson," he said, his tone cold and mocking. "Sticking your neck out for what? Justice? You won't live long enough to see it." Daniel stepped in front of Juliet, shielding her instinctively. "You've already lost, Reeves. The police are on their way. It's over." Reeves smirked, pulling a gun from inside his coat. "You think I'm afraid of the police? I've walked away from bigger messes than this. But you won't be around to see that either." Before Reeves could act, Paul appeared behind him, striking him hard with a crowbar. Reeves stumbled forward, dropping the gun, which Daniel quickly kicked out of reach. Paul grabbed Juliet's arm. "Go! Now!" They ran, finally bursting out into the cold night air. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Juliet clutched the folder as if it were her lifeline, her heart racing with relief and adrenaline. The police arrived moments later, swarming the warehouse. Reeves's men were apprehended, and Reeves himself was dragged out in handcuffs, his once arrogant expression replaced with fury. "You'll regret this," he shouted as he was forced into a squad car. "This isn't over." Juliet watched, her legs trembling from exhaustion. Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders, steadying her. "It is over," he said softly, though they both knew the fight had taken everything they had. In the weeks that followed, the evidence Juliet and Daniel had collected led to a sweeping investigation. Malcolm Reeves was charged with multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The FBI dismantled his network of shell companies, and Morton and Associates finally began to recover from the damage. Juliet and Daniel testified in court, their roles in exposing Reeves earning them both admiration and scrutiny. Despite the media attention, they remained focused on rebuilding the company and protecting its employees. 1 year later, Juliet stood in the same courtroom where Reeves had been sentenced. The memory of his glare as the judge handed down a 20-year prison sentence still lingered in her mind. But today was a different occasion. Daniel approached her, a small box in his hand. "I thought this place was fitting," he said, his voice warm and steady. "After all, it's where we finally close that chapter." Juliet smiled, her heart skipping a beat. "And what chapter are we starting now?" she asked, her voice light but filled with emotion. Daniel knelt on one knee, opening the box to reveal a simple yet elegant ring. "One where we stop running from danger and start building something together. Juliet Collins, will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, unable to speak. She pulled him to his feet, wrapping him in a tight embrace. "Yes," she whispered. "Absolutely yes." Their story became a testament to resilience, courage, and the power of doing what's right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Juliet had once thought that a single morning of being late had ruined her life. Instead, it had led her to the love of her life and the extraordinary future she had never dared to imagine. And so, together, they turned the page, ready to write the next chapter.